Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to CCS Talks, the first edition of a series of webinars and virtual panels the Global CCS Institute is looking forward to hosting to review, discuss, and analyze policies, progress, and CCS projects globally. My name is Lee Beck. I'm a senior advisor at the Global CCS Institute's office in Washington, D.C. And just for those of you who don't know the Global CCS Institute, we're an international think tank whose mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage within the net zero energy transition. We're currently located in 6 countries, and we're backed by governments, companies, and NGOs. We would also like to highlight that at this point in time, climate change remains one of the largest and most complex challenges, and that despite emissions reductions which we're expecting to see in the near term, we are still need to stay on track to a net zero emissions future. And just to put this in perspective from the CCS angle, we need to achieve 100-fold scale up from today by mid-century to stay on track to net zero emissions. The decade to 2030 will remain extremely critical because the sooner we can reduce emissions and scale up technologies like CCS, the better is our chance at fending off a worst-case climate scenario. We chose California for our first CCS talk because California has not only been regarded as one of the leaders in climate and clean energy policy, but it was also one of the first governments to enshrine carbon neutrality goals back in 2018, even before the release of the IPCC report. It's also home to one of the most innovative CCS-specific incentives, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard CCS Protocol. And the Low Carbon Fuel Standard CCS Protocol is a specifically innovative policy from our view because it not only shows how CCS can reduce emissions in the transportation sector, which is really becoming a growing headache for policymakers in advanced economies, because none of the 10 largest economies have actually been able to reduce these emissions since the 1990s. But it's also particularly innovative because it incentivizes carbon removal projects anywhere in the world, or direct air capture projects anywhere in the world. This shows that emissions are a global problem that warrants a global solution. And most importantly, since we're focused on the deployment of CCS, it has also already inspired 2 project announcements over the past year. You can find, as you can see on my slide, you can find a report about the Low Carbon Fuel Standard on our website online. And our work in California, however, is inspired by our mission at the Institute, which includes the aim to share and build knowledge globally. And as such, we don't only contribute with writing our own reports, but we support also a variety of initiatives with advocacy efforts that focus on accelerating and propelling CCS and innovation efforts in the States. As such, we're particularly honored today to welcome 3 California-based experts to discuss the latest news and developments, as well as CCS role in California's net zero and carbon neutrality transition. So what we'll do today is I will introduce the speakers, and each of the speakers will provide a presentation and give really fantastic and really interesting and new angles on the topics, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So here are our esteemed speakers. Maya Batra is the project manager for energy and land use at the Nature Conservancy in Sacramento. For me personally, her work is extremely critical because it shines light on the often overlooked land use and land conservation aspects of the net zero energy transition. Deepika Nagabhushan, who will be our first speaker today, is a program director for decarbonized fossil energy at the Clean Air Task Force, and she's also one of our esteemed Global Status of CCS 2019 contributors. The Global Status of CCS 2019 is the latest in our edition of flagship reports that summarize the global CCS developments. I'm very much looking forward to her discussion today because it will give us an introduction into the emissions profile in California and also show the specific opportunities CCS has to contribute to achieving the state's net zero or carbon neutrality goals. Finally, we'll have George Paradis give us a presentation on a carbon removal roadmap for the state. He's currently a director for carbon management partnerships at Livermore National Lab. He's a recognized and well-known expert for CCUS and has been working on the topic for decades. His policy work and convening power was also fundamental to the passage of the LCFS CCS Protocol. I will just give you a quick overview. If you'd like to submit questions, and please do, we really want to hear from you and make this an interactive session. Please submit your questions on the side panel on the right, and then we will collect them and we'll pose them to the speakers right in the end. And with this, I'm really excited for our first presenter, Deepika. I'm handing over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, Lee, for the introduction and for also having me on this really interesting panel. So I'll just begin by saying, first of all, also thank you for everyone for taking the time to attend. I'll just begin with a quick introduction to CATF because I know that there might be attendees that are not familiar. CATF is a philanthropy-funded nonprofit that was founded in Boston. We work to catalyze scalable climate solutions that are based on data we know will be needed to avoid overshooting the 1.5-degree climate goal by mid-century. We have efforts internationally, such as helping Latin American countries set up methane regulations for their oil and gas industry. And we also have some work in China relating to EOR, knowledge transfer. But majority of our work is here in the US. And I am the program manager for our CCS work under the decarbonized fossil energy focus area. And I'm based in California. And so I'm just going to start with an overview of what we're doing in California and where we see the role for CCS and how we see that CCS can be enabled to play a bigger role in California. I'll start with because I'm the first speaker of the day, I just wanted to start with stage setting. And I thought that this might be the best way to sort of orient everybody to the emissions in California by sector. As you can see, these are 2017 numbers. We have 2018 numbers, but we just don't have the analysis and sort of pie charts yet. But I would assume it's sort of similar, or maybe less emissions in total relatively to this number. But as you can see, the biggest source of emissions is in the transportation sector. Which almost equals the combined emissions from in-state power, industrial, as well as residential and commercial buildings. That's just a little orientation on that. So now that we know where the emissions are coming from, I thought that it would be best to sort of look at what policies and goals we have relevant to these sectors. So I'll start with the transportation sector. We have the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program, which aims to reduce carbon intensity of transportation fuels by 20% below the 2020 levels by 2030. It does that by setting up a credit market for low carbon fuels. And as Lee also mentioned, it also allows for new applications and new technologies to play a role, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. Then we have the Cap and Trade program, which addresses emissions from almost 85% of all the sources of GHG emissions in the state, as it covers, power plants, industrial facilities like cement and refineries as well. So the program does that by reducing the cap of allowed emissions by around 3% every year. So basically, such that in 2020, relative to business as usual, there would be a 20% reduction. This cap and trade goes all the way to 2030. And specifically for the power sector, California is among 15 states in the US that have a 100% clean electricity goal. In 2018, California legislated under SB 100, requiring 60% of electricity by 2030 to come from renewables only, and 100% to come from zero carbon resources by 2045. Which means that there is that 40% space for zero carbon resources, which would also include renewables. And 2045 finally is also important because that's the year by which California hopes to achieve carbon neutrality across the economy. Although currently there is no legislation codifying this specific goal yet, there may be some in the works. So where does CCS fit in all of this? Effective since January 2019, CCS and direct air capture are both eligible credit generation pathways under the low carbon fuel standard. There's really no other such state level incentive for CCS anywhere else in the country. As Lee also mentioned, the combination of a federal tax credit that already exists in the US, which also passed in 2018, early 2018, and then we had the LCFS credit market open up to CCS later in 2018 and effective 2019. Together, a combination of these incentives has so far enabled at least 2 publicly announced CCS projects to begin their development. The first is a project with White Energy Ethanol and Occidental Petroleum, a joint project based in Texas. The project would add CCS on the ethanol plant that will help reduce their carbon intensity of the ethanol that they supply then to California. The other one is based in California. It is a potential CCS retrofit on a power plant that is on site of a crude production field owned by CRC. This project has also received a DOE grant for their front-end engineering design study, which I believe is currently underway. Next on SB 100, CCS is not necessarily excluded from meeting the 40% piece of the zero carbon electricity supply, but what remains to be seen is what kind of CCS application will be treated as being eligible under the zero carbon electricity resource under this legislation. Right now, there are 3 agencies, the California Energy Commission, the California Public Utilities Commission, and the California Air Resources Board. All these 3 agencies are jointly hosting workshops to take public comment, and CATF has made public comments about the need to include CCS applications on both power sectors, such as NGCC or natural gas power plants, as well as CCS applications introducing hydrogen from steam methane reformation processes that will then produce zero carbon electricity. But the discussions are currently ongoing on that. The modeling report that these agencies are working on is due in January 2021. So they should be taking all the inputs in now and through the summer and have something out for public comment. If everything's on track despite COVID, if that's the case, then they should have something for public comment by fall of this year. Next is the cap and trade program. CCS is currently not an eligible mechanism for compliance under the cap, but the California Air Resources Board has indicated intention to incorporate the CCS protocol, which is currently only part of the LCFS in addressing the transportation sector, and to incorporate that same protocol into the cap and trade program at a later date, but there is no current indication of when that might happen. And now for a look into where CATF thinks we want to go with these policies. And CATF, this is how we visualize an affordable, reliable, zero carbon energy system. I know that the picture is probably too light and the lines are too light, but I'll walk you through that. It's a system in which CCS plays a cross-sector role in decarbonization. The vision is that the delivery of energy will be through a combination of zero carbon electricity, whether it's supplied by renewables, nuclear, or CCS on power, as well as zero carbon fuels, which will then either power your transport or heat and industry and all the other applications. And with zero carbon fuels also, the hope is that it will be produced either using zero carbon electricity on electrolysis or through CCS on steam methane reformation. And this is assuming that we will simultaneously mitigate upstream methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. And then the zero carbon electricity as well as zero carbon fuels will then power the end users like building heat, residential or commercial heat and industrial heat, transportation, And in addition, CCS can also be applied for reducing emissions from process emissions, like in steel or in cement manufacturing. And for reducing those emissions, there really is no alternative control technology apart from CCS. The one thing that this picture does not show is direct air capture, and we must update this image for that reason. But we also believe direct air capture will be needed to achieve negative emissions, as well as in offsetting any extremely hard to decarbonize part of this energy system. I just also wanted to sort of, just because we have this vision doesn't mean that it's possible. So just wanted to sort of throw some light on what the possibility or the potential is for CCS in California. This is just 3 bullets with 3 findings from 3 different surveys. And one is, of course, the latest one from Lawrence Livermore. You'll hear from George right after my presentation. The point I just wanted to make with this summary slide was to say that California has a lot of potential to store CO2, which could mean multiple years of emissions. And I just want to sort of go to the next slide where I can show you geographically where that might be. This is an image from West Carb study that studied the state entirely. And the light green portion in the Central Valley area, that's where likely there is potential for CO2 sequestration. And you can see that there are these little circles also. And the only thing I'd like to point out is that this map, although there hasn't been specific site characterization, but at least just knowing that there is potential for storage not too far away from potential sources of CO2 kind of shows you what kind of opportunity there might be in California. California really, it looks to me, has a lot of the characteristics to become that economy that achieves deep decarbonization using CCS, but also plays a role in advancing the technology such that it can experience cost reductions through deployment, and that will then enable other jurisdictions globally even to benefit from a technology such as CCS. And I also, sorry, just also want to make a point that there is offshore potential, but there has not been a lot of study in that area, which would be needed to really determine if there is possibility for storage in the offshore basins. This is my last slide for the day, and I just wanted to leave you all with some ideas of how CATF is thinking California can create opportunities to meet emissions reduction goals using CCS pathways. First, as I mentioned, SB 100, we currently don't know in what way the agencies will enable CCS to play a role. CATF has submitted public comments at the workshop and recommending that no application of CCS be excluded. For example, we do recommend that zero carbon electricity produced by CCS on power plants be allowed to count as zero carbon electricity produced by hydrogen that is produced using SMR CCS also be treated the same way. And there are many other applications of CCS that we believe can be useful in achieving emissions reductions and advancing the technology at the same time. We also hope that this legislation will allow for breakthrough technologies such as oxy-combustion to be eligible in meeting that 40% piece of the zero carbon electricity goal. So that's on SB 100. On LCFS, CATF has found that we've interviewed some developers confidentially, and in general, what we're hearing is that there are some barriers that continue to exist in being able to monetize the LCFS incentive, although the credit value range really high between $150 to $200 a ton. It seems like a great incentive, but we believe that there is a need for CARB to understand a little bit more of the ground reality of being able to monetize this incentive to and bridge that gap in whatever way possible to actually get projects to utilize the incentive that there is under this program. Some of the solutions we're hearing are around setting up a price floor, but that's really up to CARB to sort of see how they can help monetize the incentive that they've created. And the LCFS revisions were actually supposed to start, discussions around revisions were actually supposed to start yesterday with a public workshop that got canceled, but maybe they will host something virtually sometime soon, but there is no news on that yet. Next on cap and trade, we would, as I already mentioned, we would like to see that CCS protocol is incorporated as a compliance mechanism. This will really allow a lot of large-scale emitters to take advantage of this technology. Just for perspective, there are 50 plants in California, refineries, hydrogen production, power plants, and cement plants that all emit, each of them emit more than 500,000 tons a year, and together they emit about 67 million tons annually. CCS can be a really important tool to addressing that big piece of the pie. So that's just for context. And on carbon neutrality, as I mentioned, there is no current legislation, but there are studies being conducted right now about how carbon neutrality can be reached. But it is still focused on transportation sector. The University of California, Davis and Santa Barbara are being assigned to study both the demand and supply of transportation fuels, such that they can, achieve a fully decarbonized transportation sector by 2045. And we are trying to engage with these processes and helping them see the value in considering the role for zero carbon liquid fuels in the end state that they want to reach, and also the role for CCS in producing them, in addition to electrification, of course, which can also take advantage of CCS. And finally, with the interest in direct air capture in California, I think that it's important to always remember that we still need a place for the CO2 to go. And so, CATF believes that California should consider a storage utility concept in which there is a utility that both manages the storage and transportation of the CO2. That way, both the sources of CO2 that put on CCS or direct air capture plants can sort of solely focus on capture alone. And with that, I will end my presentation and hand back over to Lee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepika. This was great. For me personally, I think it was really good to see the opportunities to include CCS in a variety of already existing climate and policy levers. And then I also think this is really important to show the variety of policies so CCS can actually unfold its full opportunities and full potential to reduce emissions across sectors and through sector coupling. I just wanted to, before we go to George, make sure if anyone can see the control panel where you can submit questions, there is a orange little arrow. If you click that, it will pop out. For some people, as I understand, it has been hidden. So I just want to make sure that everyone has the ability to submit questions. And with this, I'm really looking forward to George's presentation about a carbon removal roadmap for the state of California, which was actually just released a few weeks ago. George, I'm handing it over to you. Thank you so much.
Of course. Hi, Lee, and hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for joining this webinar. My name is George Paradis. I have been with the Livermore National Lab here in California for just over a year now, and prior to that, I spent just over a decade in the environmental NGO world on energy and climate policy. So as Deepika mentioned a while ago, California features a mosaic of climate targets and policies that really make the state the leader that it is today on the climate change mitigation front. And I'm going to show you a slide here that summarizes the main goals. This is by no means complete, but it shows you the main targets, where we are today, and the recent substantial step up in ambition in the state's long-term goal. So Governor Schwarzenegger had issued an executive order that called for being 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Governor Brown made a change to that, and he said, no, we need to be at net zero, so not 80% below, but zero, 5 years earlier in 2045. Now, that may not seem that substantial, but actually, if you look into what this means, it actually is a very substantial step up in ambition. 20% and zero are not the same thing, and taking 5 years away from today is also an ambitious and tall order. So we embarked on a study just over a year ago, which was kindly facilitated and funded from the Climate Works Foundation and the Lawrence Livermore Foundation, to see if California can indeed meet this new carbon neutrality goal by 2045. And if so, what would it actually take? And it so happens that the difference in ambition, the difference in the mustard line and the red line that you see on your slide, which is the difference between the previous mid-century goal and the new mid-century goal, happens to be around 125 to 150 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So that was the defining goal of the study. Can we get 125 million tons of what we call negative emissions per year by 2045? What do we mean by negative emissions? Negative emissions means physically removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And you can do that in a number of ways. As you will see, you can use plants, you can use the power of nature, you can use machines with direct air capture. But we think that this is what the state will need in order to make up for emissions in sectors that are hard to abate, like Deepika just mentioned. Prime example is the transportation sector, or aviation, domestic uses that have not been fully electrified, cement, steel, and several others. So this level of negative emissions is what we think we will need in order to neutralize the residual emissions that will be around by 2045. There's no crystal ball saying that this is exactly what we'll need, but we think that this is a reasonable goal. And frankly, it's a risk management exercise. Someone in a completely different context, avoiding avalanches and getting buried, once said that relying on hope is a very bad risk management strategy. So, there are many voices who think that we should be more ambitious on several fronts, including electrification and many others. We do not disagree in the slightest, but we also don't think that we can count on having a flawless success story between now and 2045. So we think that we would be very well advised. It would be the prudent thing for the state of California to do, to find ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Okay, so starting with the high-level goal of achieving 125 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year of removal or negative emissions by mid-century, we set out on a comprehensive bottom-up quest to see how the state could do that, and if it could do that. The great news, and I'll break the conclusion to you early in case you haven't read the report, is that we think that we can do it. We can achieve California's mid-century carbon neutrality goal. How do we do it? Well, we came up with a combination of approaches that we think are the most viable. and they fall under three main pillars, which you see in front of you on the screen. The first pillar involves utilizing the power of nature. As you know, plants suck up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in natural ecosystems. So there's a whole family of natural solutions, which involves changes to how forests are managed, both commercially and forests that are in the hands of state or federal ownership. You can reforest areas that have been compromised or burned down. You can afforest areas that currently do not host any significant vegetation that holds up large amounts of carbon. You can restore wetlands, and there are many other solutions that you can be pursuing. And of course, implementing those interventions doesn't just do good things from a climate standpoint. It also enhances ecosystems, services, and water quality and air quality, and there are many other good reasons in order to pursue these solutions. The only question mark that is commonly flagged about these is permanence. As you know, California has been subject to pretty severe wildfires in recent years, and this can be a factor in the permanence of these solutions. But there are studies out there that factor in this dynamic evolution of climate. Nonetheless, we still think that we can get about 25 million tons of negative emissions per year from natural solutions, and we think that we should be pursuing those for a number of reasons. The second, and by far largest, pillar is a combination of nature and engineering, and essentially it lets nature take up the CO2 from the atmosphere using the growth of biomass, which we would then convert into zero or negative carbon fuels. Now, before some of you rebel against the idea, we took great care to limit ourselves to streams of what we thought were genuine waste biomass streams. So there are no assumptions for growing energy crops or for logging more intensively or for otherwise disturbing natural ecosystems or even human managed ecosystems. We took what we thought were genuine wastes that would be available under a business as usual scenario. What do these feedstocks include? Well, there's a whole family of biomass that you can biomass types that you can source. Starting with the largest, as you may know, California and the U.S. Forest Service, Federal Forest Service, have set themselves a goal of preemptively treating certain amounts of land, which they aspire to be 1 million acres a year in the coming years, in order to implement fuel reduction projects that would prevent the initiation of wildfires at the scale that we have seen recently, and also decrease their severity. Now, these treatments have already begun, and the biomass, as we understand it, is being piled up in situ. Some of it is being combusted intentionally during low fire danger season. Some of it has no outlet because of air quality concerns. You cannot always do controlled burns. There's often not the resources or the funding or the personnel to actually do anything with that biomass that's getting piled in place. Its two possible fates are either that it would decompose in place and that would release its carbon back to the atmosphere, or if it does burn again, it would release it because of combustion. So either way, we have a carbon deficit or an additive term to the atmosphere, and we think we have a better use for that. The other source is municipal solid waste. California is a highly populated state, especially in the south, and those population centers produce a substantial amount of waste, some of which has biogenic content. And this could be paper, cardboard that doesn't get recycled. It could be food scraps. It could be many other things. all of that has carbon contained in it that came from the atmosphere when plants absorbed it. And again, rather than taking this to landfill, we think that we can put this to better use. And then finally, as you know, California has a very large agricultural base. The Central Valley is one of the main areas that provides farming products to the United States and much more broadly. And as a result of farming, there's a large amount of waste biomass that gets produced from orchards and from many, many other operations that typically either gets burned or decomposes. There are several other smaller subclasses of feedstock here, which I won't go into. But once we have sourced this waste biomass, what we then do it is we take it through processes like gasification or pyrolysis and make gaseous or liquid transportation fuels. And we strip out either all the carbon or the majority of the carbon or a large portion of it to make hydrogen fuel or to make other biofuels that can be used broadly in the transportation sector. And using carbon capture and geologic storage, we put that carbon away. So the net flow is from the atmosphere back to the ground where it came from. And this, as you see, is the largest of the three pillars at an estimated 80-odd million tons of negative emissions per year. That combination of natural solutions and waste biomass still doesn't get us to the 125 million ton a year mark. So what makes up the shortfall? The answer is direct air capture. And what that does is it uses machines, takes CO2 from the atmosphere, and then puts it underground. We think that California has good resources to deploy direct air capture. I'll get to geology in a minute, but we also have geothermal power that could feed the heat needs of this technology. And this can also act as a buffer. So if we fall short on conversion of waste biomass or natural solutions, then we can call on direct air capture, since it's modular, to pick up the slack. So this is the fundamental skeleton of how we get there. This shows you the flow of carbon. So it always starts from the atmosphere, and then either plants or machines grab it. It may either stay stored or bound in ecosystems, or it can be stripped using carbon capture technologies and then be put underground. The very surprising conclusion from all this was that this is nowhere near as expensive as you would think. So we think that for $10 to $15 billion per year, and please do keep in mind the scale of California's economy here, this is a fraction of what we spend each year for waste management, household waste management. We can actually achieve this level of negative emissions and really firm up the state's chances of meeting its mid-century carbon neutrality goals. And even better, I think we have co-benefits, which we'll touch on in a minute, in terms of air quality and in-state employment. Here's the cost curve. There's a lot of work embedded in this graph, but it attempts to summarize where we stand. You'll be familiar with how these curves work. So the width of each column represents the volume of CO2 reductions that we think we can get in negative emissions, and then the height corresponds to the cost. So you'll see that natural solutions are by far the cheapest on the left, reinforcing the notion that they should be pursued for a host of reasons that don't just relate to carbon. On the far right, you'll see that we have direct air capture, and there was quite a bit of debate as to the price point of direct air capture. I think we got screamed at by everybody. Those who were developing the technology who thought that we weren't being optimistic enough, and those who are researching the subject and thought that we're being too optimistic. We stand our ground. it's around the $200 mark or just under that, and that includes, for clarification here, a modest amount of technological learning by doing. So current costs are higher. There are studies that say that if you deploy a gigaton globally of direct air capture, you will be at a lower price point. So we don't disagree, but we also didn't think that it was prudent to assume a gigaton of deployment by 2045 when it comes to a California-specific study. So we assumed a more modest amount of learning on the scale of a few tens of megatons, of million tons per year, and through that we realize the initial steeper cost reductions that come in a learning curve from direct air capture, which drops us to just below $200 a ton. And we think that California could either deploy all of that on its own, or it could share the burden with other jurisdictions around the world. In the middle of the cost curve, you will see several processes that convert waste biomass to fuels, and depending on the exact feedstock, whether it's waste, or whether it's forest biomass, or whether it's agriculture residue, and the exact nature of the process, you will get a different price point. But they're all in the $30 to $60 a ton range, which is easily within the current low carbon fuel standard credit prices, which have been hovering around the $200 per ton mark for some time now. So none of this is outlandish or outside the scope of what California has in place. Now, I think there will be some tweaks needed to current programs and regulatory structures to make sure that these projects go ahead. But we're not talking $600 a ton. I think most of these are very manageable, also owing to the fact that there are existing frameworks to deal with this kind of thing. Geologic storage, Deepka mentioned several high-level studies that have been undertaken at basin level. We decided to get more specific and look at individual regions at much higher resolution using publicly available data. So we looked at a region in the Sacramento Valley on the northern part of the Central Valley, California, and also in the San Joaquin Basin in the southern part of the valley. And as it turns out, California has truly been blessed with ample capacity, and because of the young nature, the age of the sediments that are not yet fully consolidated, we have a lot of space, and the basins are deep and really truly suitable for secure storage and compliance with the strict regulations that we have in place. So just in those two areas, we found that we have between 17 and 200 gigatons of billion tons of CO2 storage available. This is a number that means that we will not be running out of storage anytime soon, and that really we are pretty spoiled for choice, and these would be world-class geologic storage sites. Finally, what will it take to realize this vision? And if we set about implementing it, what would be the co-benefits? Well, this won't happen without some kind of concerted action, both from the state government side and the private sector side, but also civil society. We need to build new infrastructure. You will need conversion plants for the biomass. You will need to recruit landowners for the natural solutions. You will need to build a CO2 pipeline, an example of which you can see on the top right in red, that essentially links CO2 sources, the conversion plants, to the good geologic storage, which happens to lie smack in the middle of the state. None of these undertakings are prohibitive, and they are a relatively small fraction of the infrastructure that currently transports oil and gas around the state, but it needs to be developed over a couple of decades or so. So we do have a challenge in terms of getting our act in order and not wasting time. From an engineering standpoint, this is not a big deal. And we also need to buy down the cost of direct air capture. And you'll see on the bottom right the typical learning curve for a technology like direct air capture. You'll see that the steepest part of the curve of the learning happens early on. So that's what we need to aim for, to make sure that we climb down this cost curve as soon as possible by strategically deploying a certain amount of the technology early on. What are the co-benefits from an undertaking like this? Well, wildfire prevention and management. I think those fuels treatments and the conversion of waste biomass from the forest into fuels is a win-win, both from a carbon standpoint and from preventing the initiation of wildfires or the severity getting as high. The Central Valley of California is the breadbasket, if you like, of California and much further, but it also is an economically depressed area in many places, and always in need of jobs. So this would create Central Valley jobs, because that's where the CO2 storage is located, and that's where a lot of the biomass lies. The Central Valley also hosts operation from the state's oil industry, which are substantial. California usually comes third or fourth in terms of oil producing states in the United States, juggles with Alaska for that spot. So there's a large oil industry in California, and it also has a carbon footprint which many governors and legislators have tried to grapple with. What do we do with this? California is very ambitious on the carbon front on one hand. On the other hand, it has this oil industry. I think this set of solutions here lays a pathway for the state's oil industry that is way lower carbon and also taps into its talents. Think what you may of the oil industry, you may love it, you may hate it, but it's unquestionable that they become very, very good at poking holes in the ground. And this could be a great asset when it comes to storing CO2 permanently in geologic storage. Finally, a word on air quality. California has some of the worst air quality in the nation, and we, on an annual basis, this is made even clearer, and we desperately need measures to improve that air quality. Reducing the use of fossil fuels and substituting them with hydrogen from waste biomass would make a great contribution towards improving air quality. Reducing wildfires would also do the same, and also reducing the intentional or controlled burning of waste biomass would again go a long way towards improving some of the state's air quality problems. And we think that this set of solutions could greatly help. So in conclusion, we think that California can meet its mid-century carbon neutrality goals by pursuing this family of technologies and solutions. There are compelling reasons to pursue them beyond carbon, but we will need a significant mobilization of policy instruments and actors in order to realize that, and the 25 years that is available to us in order to meet that goal. Thank you for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you so much, George, for this really insightful presentation. So there are a lot of great questions coming in. I'd also like to refer you to the written report, which is very detailed, really fantastic. It can be downloaded on the Lawrence Livermore National Lab's website for free. And I also wanted to quickly say thank you so much, George, for talking about the value the low carbon fuel standard is currently trading at. There are multiple questions on the cap and trade price at the moment. So the last auction in February was closing at around $18 a ton. I just wanted to say that quickly before we move on to our next and final panelist, Maya Batra from the Nature Conservancy. I think this will be a really, really insightful presentation as well, with, as I mentioned earlier, really important energy and land use, as well as land conservation aspect of the net zero energy transition. Maya, over to you.
Thanks, Lee. I'm Maya Batra. I'm from the Nature Conservancy, and I'm going to start my presentation now. I think everyone should be able to see my screen. I'm glad I've made it this far without technical difficulties. Again, my name is Maya. I'm a project manager for energy and land use at the Nature Conservancy, California. The focus of my work is the intersection of biodiversity conservation and clean energy infrastructure planning, working in collaboration with scientists and policy experts across the state. I always like to open my presentations with a photo of one of the places that we help protect. This is Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge on the California-Nevada border. It's home to at least 26 endemic species. It's a really beautiful place, and I like to set the stage with sharing some of the landscapes that TNC is interested in protecting. Okay, so this presentation is going to have two parts. The first part, I will overview the work that TNC California does in this space, and then I'll share some considerations for direct air capture and CCS technologies. But before we get going, I'll also share with you my takeaways in case you tune out right now. First is a large portfolio of tools will be needed to achieve decarbonization. The second is that investments in direct air capture and CCS now sets up long-term opportunities for these technologies at scale. And third, we think that more research is needed to fully understand the benefits and trade-offs of direct air capture and CCS technologies. So try and keep those in mind as I go through this presentation. So we'll get started on the first part, the Nature Conservancy and our work in California. For those of you who don't know, TNC, we are a science-based global conservation organization that works in 50 states and 79 countries to protect ecologically important lands and waters. We have 4 organizational priorities: protect land and water, tackle climate change, provide food and water sustainably, and build healthy cities. I'll be talking today about our work that falls under our tackle climate change priority, which includes infrastructure for decarbonization, as well as some of the natural climate solutions that George mentioned. TNC is really a leader in this space, so I just want to flag that for everyone. While we are a very large organization, we're also a very local organization. So here in California, we are land stewards across the state, from the Klamath Basin to the Mojave Desert, working at local levels to innovate science-based solutions that fit for those places, but that also can be scaled to have exponential impacts at a state, national, and global level. The California chapter of the Nature Conservancy has protected 1.2 million acres of land and 3.8 million acres of ocean habitat. And as such, we have a deep expertise in land use planning, which we think is a critical component to scaling up the infrastructure needed to address California's climate and energy goals. Our research shows that the scale of clean energy infrastructure needed in the United States is significant, up to 75 million acres of land, which equals about 100 Yosemite national parks. And as has already been mentioned, California is leading the way in adopting and implementing ambitious climate and energy policies. So recognizing the critical inflection point that we are at and the opportunity we have at this moment in implementing our state's ambitious goals, and the important natural and working lands in California, the focus of my team's work is the intersection of biodiversity conservation and building out the infrastructure needed to achieve our state's energy and climate goals, leveraging our experience in land use planning and energy policy, as well as regulatory processes, which I've flagged up there and Deepika has already mentioned, to achieve outcomes that can accelerate deployment of low impact clean energy and negative emissions infrastructure. We use multiple tools to do this, and I'd like to specifically highlight our recent report, The Power of Place, which studied land use requirements for renewable energy resources under 4 different levels of environmental protection and across 3 different geographic areas. So what we did is that we used geospatial data to inform environmentally constrained supply curves, and we combined those with the same long-term energy models that the state uses in its energy planning processes. And we were able to identify pathways to achieve our climate and energy goals, meet California energy demand, and also protect nature. Finally, a big part of my job is ensuring that appropriate safeguards and regulatory regimes exist for the development of any type of infrastructure project. All right, I'm going to move on to the second part of the presentation, which is considerations for direct air capture, carbon capture, and storage technologies. So the first technology I'll talk about is direct air capture. At this point, you've gotten good overviews by George and Deepika on the potential emissions benefits of these technologies and how they fit into the state's goals. The focus of what I'm going to talk about is the lens that TNC and my team specifically brings to this, and that relates to the development and deployment and infrastructure and land use considerations. So the main benefit of direct air capture is that the technology itself can go pretty much anywhere, and it doesn't compete with arable land, which is good in California, where we have a lot of high value production agricultural land. But probably the most significant limitation on the deployment of direct air capture at scale is the electricity and heat intensity of the technology and the implications for decisions related to where you locate those facilities and the land use considerations that go along with that. So here you see a figure from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab's report that George mentioned, showing the land requirements for 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide stored per year, using various technologies to power the direct air capture facility. So I've circled here 23 square kilometers that are needed to power direct air capture for 1 million metric tons. If you multiply that times 50, you get 1,150 square kilometers, which is almost half of Yosemite National Park. That land use requirement at scale has the potential to add to the pressure on land in California, which is going to be balancing multiple priorities like providing energy, serving important ecosystem services, growing food, and housing Californians across the state. And of course, once you've captured the carbon dioxide, you'll need to transport it to an end user or to a storage site. And one of the things that we think about is that the further that direct air capture facility is located from the end user storage site, the more infrastructure will be required to move the carbon dioxide. This is an area that we could really benefit from more research in. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the great work that Dr. Jen Wilcox is doing in this space if you're interested in learning more. I'll flag a couple of the outstanding research questions that come to mind for me. The first is researching operational improvements to the electricity and heat needs that could make a big difference in scaling these technologies. Additionally, I think there's a lot of research to be done in exploring the benefits and trade-offs of co-locating direct air capture facilities with other resources, including the geothermal resources that California has, like those in the Salton Sea, where important revenue streams are needed and could benefit from this type of innovative project. That type of information could help the state and developers make strategic decisions about viable project locations. I'm only going to briefly speak about carbon capture technologies because this is the outskirts of my expertise, and there's several experts on the phone who can fill in the gaps here. But I just want to share a couple of thoughts about how we are thinking about point source capture and technologies like natural gas with carbon capture and storage. So first, the Nature Conservancy's research shows that anywhere from 1.6 to 3.1 million acres of renewable energy could be needed to achieve California's clean energy targets. As we move towards deeper decarbonization and carbon neutrality in specific, keeping options on the table like natural gas with carbon capture could yield multiple benefits, including lower overall cost of a clean energy system, helping to avoid the overbuild of solar to meet storage needs, and other ancillary benefits to a mostly renewable electric grid. Second, California has a commitment to a clean energy future and also to a healthy state. I think it's really important that we address the environmental impacts associated with the production of fossil fuels, and that includes air quality issues, water degradation, and ecosystem and biodiversity impacts. It's really critical that these facilities are cleaner all around for the residents of California. And I'll just point out the two photos that I have on here. One is it's borrowed from the Energy Futures Initiative, Optionality, Flexibility, and Innovation Report on Achieving California's 2030 Climate Targets. I highly recommend that report. The photo on the right is a picture of the Net Power gas facility in Texas. As I understand it, it's on about 13 acres, which is relatively small compared to renewable energies. All right, we have a geologist on the call, so I will have him answer any specific questions about California's geology, but I will just echo some of what we heard already, which is that California has an opportunity to leverage its strong geologic storage resources for carbon dioxide removal. And for me, it's really hard not to be excited about the potential that the state can have as a laboratory for emissions reduction strategies globally. One of the things that we think about as a global organization at TNC is the potential to scale these technologies outside of the United States. I think especially the ability to provide low cost, zero carbon resources in places that are still developing is going to be critical from an energy equity perspective. And it's a framework that has not been really applied too much in this space. So what do we need to do to scale this technology up? And specifically as it relates to storage, we first need to invest in robust site characterizations to ensure we are locating these projects in the places that are most safe and suitable to do so. Once those sites have been identified, to the extent possible, coordination to enable hubs and clusters will make projects more economical, and I think critical to how we approach technology generally. It will avoid a piecemeal approach to infrastructure decisions. It's important to mention that we haven't seen a storage project in California, and as with anything new, we're going to need to be thinking about the potential policy and legal issues that can emerge in this space as it develops. And I think I specifically am thinking about pore space rights because those have not yet been litigated in California. Finally, and I won't talk too much about this because it could be an entire webinar, permanence is going to be really key for any type of carbon storage, whether it's natural climate solutions or technological. I'll just mention that transparent monitoring and reporting is a really important part of gaining public confidence in what is a nascent technology to California. So I think you'll hear a lot of people say this technology is proven, this technology is demonstrated, but I still think we have a long way to go when it comes to the public perception of these technologies in this state specifically. I think the first successful project in California will be one that doesn't just tell people that it's stored permanently and securely. It's going to be one that really shows people and gets community buy-in on a first project. All right, I will wrap this up again with my key takeaways. A large portfolio of tools will be needed to achieve deep decarbonization. Investing in these technologies now sets us up for long-term success. So while we may not need these technologies in the next 5 to 10 years, it's critical that we start thinking about what role they will play down the road. And then finally, I flagged a couple of different research questions. To the extent that we can start investigating those questions here in California now, in collaboration with organizations who are on this call and state agencies, I think that's going to get us a long way in accelerating the technology. I will end there. Thanks so much, Lee.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Maya. This was great. I would like to emphasize that we anticipate sharing all the presentations in the next few days on our website, because there have been multiple questions on whether we will be able to share the presentations, and there will also be a recording of this webinar. And yeah, so let's dive into questions. George, let's start with you because there were a lot of questions for you already. Can you talk to us a little bit about clarifying? So you talked about negative emissions from direct air capture, BACs, land use, but also this is in addition to capture from point sources like industrial emissions, say cement, and also includes point source capture like ethanol. Is that correct?
Yes, and this is one of the questions that we get most often, and it definitely merits clarification. So we set ourselves what we think is a more ambitious goal. So we absolutely need to be abating existing emissions or avoiding them. So it depends whether you want to call them avoided or displaced or reduced. And that would include things like capturing CO2 from cement plants and power plants and refineries and so on. That wasn't what we defined as negative emissions. So negative emissions mean there must be a physical removal from the atmosphere. And you can grab it using machines or you can grab it using biomass. But if you capture from a from a refinery or a steel facility, then that is the avoidance of an emissions that would have otherwise happened. It's not a net removal from the atmosphere. So I hope that clarifies. We think that all these negative emission interventions that I outlined need to be done on top of every other mitigation effort plus more that the state has in mind right now. So this is not a license to substitute pollution or emissions for a net removal. This is something that needs to be done over and above what the state has in mind on mitigation.
Perfect, thank you. And then just to tag onto this, Maya, there was a question. You mentioned the co-location of direct air capture and industrial sources of emissions to achieve, for efficiency purposes or to achieve economies of scale. I mean, this is a question for all of you since you're all CCS experts, but how far along is that idea, and is that idea being considered in any of your models?
That's a really good question. I think George has probably done the most work in this space, but I'll say it's some of the graphics that were shown today show the overlap both in natural, and I think Deepika actually had the image, show the overlap in sources and storage sites. So it's not too hard to put those things together. I think one of the questions will be, how do you explore infrastructure opportunities like existing right-of-ways to try and accelerate the process of getting that infrastructure on the ground?
Any additions to this, Deepika or George?
Again, I think, like Maya said, George might know the most about this topic, but all I'll say is that while that's an opportunity that must be explored, like Maya said, I also think that there are other considerations that will be that will need to be thought about. Like, for instance, like George said, there needs to be access to clean electricity. So it will depend on how can a direct air capture project access clean electricity and then access infrastructure that can transport the CO2 to where the storage is, even if it's not close by. So I think that electricity is going to be one of the biggest factors in determining where direct air capture can go. Perfect,
thank you. George, anything to add? Maybe also there's a question on the cost. You mentioned $10 to $15 billion a year on your slide. Does that include infrastructure and storage?
This is all inclusive. So this is the the sourcing of the biomass, the implementation of the natural solutions, transportation to any conversion sites that may be there, piping and compressing the CO2, transporting it using pipelines or trucks or barges, injection, monitoring, etc. And the only thing that I would add to the previous question is that for direct air capture, the primary energy need is heat, not so much electricity. I think electricity is about a fifth, heat is the rest. California does have substantial geothermal resources. For example, in the Salton Sea area, unfortunately, the geology there is not conducive for CO2 storage. So we should definitely avoid putting CO2 in shallow fractured sediments, but you solve all that by building a CO2 pipeline, which in fact will be nowhere near as big as what is in place right now in West Texas and parts of the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, but it would be new to California.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, just scrolling through the questions here. Wow, there's so many. Thank you, everyone, for being so engaged. Deepika, you mentioned a really interesting concept that we're all a fan of, carbon utility. Can you tell us a little bit more about where this concept, at what stage this concept is at, how you see it become important over the next 30 years as we're really trying to reach net zero emissions, and then also any specific other states beyond California that you've been thinking of?
So the concept of storage utility, I think it's quite an old one. It's been floating around in the community for quite a while. I think what it's waiting for is, studies to be done, and states to perhaps regionally coordinate, because geology is not restricted by state lines. I know of efforts that are underway. I think there's one in the Michigan area led by Batel, and then there's one effort happening in the Gulf Coast area for offshore storage, and there are studies being conducted right now. There's also a government program called Carbon Safe that is studying, I think, like the southeastern part of the US. So there are studies happening that will identify more clearly what the storage possibility and capacities can be, and what locations can be useful. And with California, there was an effort called WestCarb, but I think that is currently not funded. And please correct me if I'm wrong on that. But the idea would be for California to sort of do more studies in that direction. And with a utility, you can choose the right location. Make sure that drinking water is safe, and make sure we're avoiding all the land where, as Maya said, that provide ecosystem services, and sort of, meet all those criteria while setting up specific storage location that can have capacities to take CO2 from several sources at a time. So that, to sort of set up transportation and storage structures in such a way that the capturers just have to think about, incentivizing the capture equipment, I feel like will really enable faster deployment of this technology and faster achievement of carbon reductions. I think that a coordinated effort with carbon sources and the research, together, I think can work to sort of come up with a strategy that can achieve the highest level of protection, as well as highest level of storage volumes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Somebody wanted to add something? No, I guess this was just something that I heard. Okay, thank you so much. This is really, really interesting, and I think everyone is looking forward to how this concept will be fleshed out. Maya, I have a question for you. Power to Place study. I think I've heard that there will be exciting new work with regards to CCS coming forward. And so maybe it would be great if you could give us a little bit of insights into this from TNC's perspective. But also, there were a couple of questions on direct air capture requirements or land use impacts or footprints. If you could talk a little bit about this, that would be very helpful. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. We're really excited about the Power of Place work. We've had a lot of success in leveraging the land use approach to building out infrastructure for renewables specifically. The next step in our study is to expand the study to look beyond just California's 2045 energy demand and incorporate the demand of the rest of the states in the West, so 11 states. And we're hoping to add layers of technologies onto that modeling, which could include CCS and direct air capture. So trying to understand the benefits and trade-offs of a broader suite of technologies to help us meet our clean energy goals, while also seeing what land use either benefits or trade-offs will come from that. As I mentioned, direct air capture, if powered by renewables, tends to be pretty land intensive, and so exploring opportunities to co-locate that technology next to other electricity and heat sources. I mentioned the Salton Sea, so that's something that we could study in more depth in the next iteration of the study. I think there's a range of how much land it takes to power a direct air capture facility, and I included a chart which will be available in my slides from the Livermore Lab report. For solar, I've heard anywhere from 250 to 500 megawatts. I think it's going to be very different for natural gas with CCS. So those are some of the considerations that we will probably try to study in the next version of the Power of Place.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, I have another question for all of you. This is around geologic storage and public acceptance / public confidence. Can you elaborate a little bit on, when you talk about safe and secure geologic storage, what does that mean? And what kinds of data do you think is important to have to really instill public confidence in secure and safe storage? And anything else you'd like to add on the topic, since this is a topic that comes up very often? Maybe also if you'd like to touch on offshore storage and where this is at. I mean, we've talked a little bit about this. Anyone would like to go first? George, maybe?
Sure. So what do we mean by secure storage? Well, let's first of all think where the carbon came from to begin with. The fossil fuel resources that we are burning today have been stored in sedimentary rocks. In the case of California, for millions of years. In the case of the world more broadly, for up to hundreds of millions of years. That's when they originated. And all we're doing is putting a small fraction of the carbon that we've been furiously digging up for the past century and a half back where it came from. So this is not a novel concept. It's just a small reversal of the what we've been doing. What constitutes secure? Well, it means that you shouldn't be causing any leakage of CO2, and you shouldn't be putting the public and workers at risk. We think that this is extremely manageable. This is well within the bound of operations that the oil and gas industry has been undertaking for a long time now. For those of you who are skeptical about what the oil and gas industry has been doing, let me offer you this. So, for economic reasons mainly, to be blunt, the regulations that have been governing oil and gas production have tended to be on the light side. There is a very strong difference between those in many states in the US, but also federally, and the regulations that govern oil and gas, that govern CO2 injection. So those date to the last 10 years at most. They're very recent. The most recent one, the California CCS Protocol, is not even 2 years old. And it goes way, way beyond what oil and gas regulations do. And it was written for the specific purpose of keeping CO2 in the ground. So many of if you look at mishaps that have happened in the oil and gas sector over the years, Aliso Canyon, the Macondo blowout, and by BP on the Gulf Coast, none of these things would ever have happened. They wouldn't even come close to passing even the most basic requirements under those regulations. So a lot of what's happened can be prevented, and we have full faith, and this is based on more than 2 decades worth of research at the lab, but also many other places in the US and around the world, that once you put CO2 down there, if you pick your site correctly and if you don't make any super dumb mistakes, that CO2 is going to stay down there, and you actually have a very hard time pulling it back up. Now, there's a whole separate question here. What would a local stakeholder need to know in order to be convinced of this or comfortable with the idea? And that's a very location-specific question, and Deepka and Manya may want to weigh in. But in general, you will see that those who are familiar with oil and gas, will not necessarily be scared by the idea of another well or two. And let's also keep in mind that CO2 sequestration does not need many wells. So we're not talking about a new wave of drilling. I think one well could handle 1 million tons a year and good geology, and maybe you'll have 1 or 2 monitoring wells around it. So footprint is small, but what folks will need and how they'll react is a very location specific question, and we would all be well advised to make early contact with these people and say, okay, let's talk about what you may be concerned about, and go through the information as thoroughly as we can.
Yeah, Lee, I can add on. This is Maya. I can add on to that. I think for a lot of people, this is a new technology. And so there's some degree of socialization that needs to happen with communities who aren't familiar with storage or carbon capture technologies generally. It's very technical. There's conflation of words, negative emissions versus abated emissions. So education, I think, is going to be a really big part of it. I think there's also some warranted distrust of the oil and gas industry leading the charge in developing these technologies. To that effect, I would say, part of the reason that TNC is at the table and that other environmental organizations show up to these conversations is because we care about having robust environmental safeguards while also meeting our greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, because I really think we have to act on every tool in the toolbox right now. We're not really in a position to take options off the table. And so as a mitigation strategy, what we can do as advocates is make sure that there are robust safeguards, that this is being done in the right place, and that we continue to transition to a cleaner energy future. And that means more than just emissions reductions, but also improving ecosystems and making sure that people are involved in that process.
Perfect, thank you. I think this is very insightful and very important to highlight as we're really getting ready to deploy these solutions to ensure that we have community buy-in and ensure obviously safety and transparency of the deployment of all of these technologies. Okay, we're coming almost to a close here. I would like to pose one more question to the three of you, and that is, first of all, there are a lot of questions on 45Q, which for those of you who don't know is one of the most progressive CCS specific incentives globally. From the Institute's perspective, it's a federal tax credit that will provide up to $50 a ton of CO2 stored via geologic storage and $35 a ton of CO2 stored via enhancer recovery. So the first question is, how do you see this being used for all of these options that we've talked today in terms of carbon capture and storage? And then the second question is, what other policy incentives should policymakers or could policymakers consider, particularly as they're thinking of economic stimulus? So there's a lot of questions about these, but also particularly for hard to abate sectors. Deepika, you want to go first?
So the first question was about how 45Q is incentivizing projects. I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm answering the right question.
Yes, I am. Sorry, okay. I buried a lot of 1, 2, 3, so you should never do this. Okay. So yes, first question is 45Q and how you think it will be applied in the state. And second question, what other policy options are there for governments to consider with respect to economic stimulus and or industrial emissions?
Okay. So in response to the first question, 45Q, when it was passed in 2018, it really stirred a lot of interest in developers. And 2 years later, earlier this year, they announced some guidelines that the industry was waiting for. The industry is still waiting for some guidelines on additional topics, such as, credit recapture and liability with regard to that. Before they make some investment decisions. But despite that, we know of several projects that are at different stages of development already, but still waiting for that guidance from the US Treasury to clarify exactly what liability they may have. There was some guidance this year on what constitutes commenced construction. And so the projects need to commence construction or prove that they've commenced construction by the 1st of January 2024, and that is a little bit of a challenge for some kinds of projects that might be interested in going forward, just because they are larger scale and they take a longer time to go through the development journey, which includes many steps like feasibility studies and a lot of other engineering studies that have to take place, and all the procurement and things like that before construction can begin. However, there are a lot of other opportunities that probably can make it within this deadline. Like, for instance, potential CCS on things like ethanol, which they're simpler projects and take lesser time to develop and build as well. So I think that there's a range of interest in making use of 45Q, and I think specifically when 45Q tax credits are combined with the LCFS incentive, which as I mentioned, is really high. It creates a broader opportunity. However, I think I want to flag again what I said earlier, that we're hearing from project developers that are thinking about LCFS is that there are some barriers in being able to monetize that. So I think that there are things that need to change, and with LCFS to really see the results that we would like to see, and in terms of project deployment. But in terms of like additional work on stimulus, I feel like I don't have much to add there, but I'll let the other panelists add their thoughts on that.
Perfect, thank you. Maya or George?
No comments from me, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you. George, anything else?
The only addition I would make is that if you look at anyone who, we have about 4 or 5 projects in development in California right now that I'm aware of. You talk to any of those and they have 2 things in mind: 45Q and low carbon fuel standard. So it's pretty obvious that they are looking for ways to make the time window for 45Q and processing what the Internal Revenue Service has put out as guidelines. It's not my position to say what else should be done, but I can make the observation that those 2 instruments have very much been picked up, and that's what's caused the very strong interest right now in developing CCS projects in California.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Unfortunately, we are at the end of the webinar. This was 90 minutes full on CCS, which was really, really great. I thought, just from my perspective, key takeaways are that we need a portfolio of options, including carbon capture and negative emissions, to reach climate goals. And the sooner we can deploy these technologies, the better our chance at fending off the worst case of climate. It's also particularly relevant in a globally equitable and affordable energy transition. So we're really looking to California as a leader in innovation, who, with its leadership, could really enable technology access around the world, and enable for other countries to access a lower cost energy transition. And then finally, I think George and everyone actually mentioned this, is that there are particularly important co-benefits and values to societies that come with the deployment of advanced energy technologies like carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, BECCS. And this is also particular at the Institute. We've been researching this topic now for a while, and we're looking forward to releasing a report on the value of CCS to society in the next coming weeks. So please stay tuned. Next week we'll have also, there were a lot of questions on geologic storage. So please tune in next week when we'll have our next webinar. You can sign up on our website, which will be just on focusing on geologic storage, and we'll have our premier expert, Dr. Christopher Consoli, to talk about this really, really important topic from Australia. And there were so many questions. I'm really, really overwhelmed by this interactive sessions, and we're so grateful to have a really fantastic audience today. Please do submit any further questions that you have, either for us at the Institute or for Maya, George, or Deepika, to webinar@globalccsinstitute.com. We are monitoring this this inbox, and we are hoping to get back to you. And you will also receive an email once we've uploaded the complete webinar recording. Maya, George, Deepika, thank you so much for joining us from California today, and we're looking forward to seeing everyone for our next CCS talk. Thank you so much. Bye.